Hello and welcome to Juliet and Lucy's Quiet Leadership Revolution, the podcast for senior and aspiring leaders who want to make their voice heard, their impact felt through thoughtful, reflective, confident leadership. People who want to lead by example, bring others with them, and who are ready to learn and adapt to deliver brilliant results. I'm Juliet Corbett.
And I'm Lucy Gower. And today we're going to talk about leading creative teams. And what we mean here is, as a leader, how do you help your team to solve problems, have creative ideas, and to create an environment where they are genuinely able to do that? And it's not just something that gets talked about, it plays out in your behaviours. So actually, I know that we've talked about creativity before, but I think perhaps it's helpful just to define it up front.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to put a link to that other creativity, I think it was creative barriers we talked about in the previous episode, but link to that in the episode notes. But yeah, Lucy, tell us, what are we talking about here with creativity? How do you define it?
I define it as solving problems. It's not about being able to draw. It's about being able to make connections to come up with perhaps new solutions to problems. So it's not any more complicated than that. It's about your process to solve problems that need solving.
Yeah, fantastic. And what we're going to do this time is keep it a bit more tactical, step by step, guiding you through a process that you can use in your own team or your own organisation to help your teams to become more creative and to think more creatively. So, Lucy, what's the first step that we don't want to miss?
First step we don't want to miss is that, just to reinforce that every human being is creative. We are all creative animals. We survive due to our ability to solve problems, and it manifests itself different for every single one of us. So you might be a brilliant wordsmith. You might be great at spreadsheets. So you can see numbers in a way that other people don't. You might be able to open your fridge and cook a meal out of whatever's in there. All of that counts as creativity. You're solving problems. So the first thing, and I know that I talk about this a lot because it is so important, is believing that you are creative. Doesn't mean drawing. It means solving problems. And actually, as a leader of a team, the more diverse your team is, with different skills and experiences and different creative threads that run through every single person, that's when you have a really great environment, because people think differently, bounce ideas around. You don't have groupthink in quite the same ways as if everybody's thinking about something in the same way. So that person that says, I'm not creative, I don't know anything about this, brilliant, bring them into the fold on trying to solve that problem, because they will see it from a different perspective, which often opens up new ways of thinking.
Yeah. So we're talking here about harnessing a skill set that's present in everybody, whether they acknowledge it or not. So we're harnessing something that's already there. We're also creating a space and a structure for that to thrive. As well within your team.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Exactly. And then if I'm going to get into the kind of process bit of creativity, the first thing is identifying the problem that you are aiming to solve. And there's several things around that. Sometimes we focus in on solving the wrong problem. Sometimes we can be really focusing in on, I don't know, like looking at what our data looks like. And actually the data that we are pulling together isn't what's even required for the problem that we're trying to solve. There's this famous, I don't even know if it's true, but I'm going to say it because it's come into my mind and it'll get in my way if I don't say it out loud. There's this famous story, probably not true, about when NASA was developing a pen to write in space, and they spent a lot of budget on figuring out how to move ink down in a pen with zero gravity, and they couldn't figure it out. And so they went and asked the Russian space team, who said they just used a pencil. So NASA were trying to solve the problem of how do we get a pen to write in space. The Russian space team were figuring out, how do you write in space? I don't think that's a true story, but I love the illustration. So you can spend a lot of time focusing on the wrong thing if you're not digging into what is the problem that you are trying to solve. And then there's something important about how you frame that problem. There's a a line of research from Harvard around how using the words "how might we" is really important in terms of how it signals to our brain possibilities. So rather than saying how can we develop a pen to write in space, how might we conjures up possibilities. How can we or how should we somehow implies some sort of judgment and that there's a right and wrong. There isn't a right and wrong. How might we is helping us to think big about the different possibilities that might work. So language is really key here.
Yeah, absolutely. My brain always goes to the parallel between this and strategy. And when you're looking at that problem that you're solving, there's also a kind of an inbuilt test, if you like, of is this the right problem? Like, just because it is a problem also doesn't mean that it is the right problem to solve next, given that what we're talking about here is takes time, takes resource to do. However we might want to make it as streamlined as possible, it is going to take time and energy for your team. So I guess there's a question in here about all the different problems that you could solve, and then which ones are you going to actually really apply your creativity to?
Exactly. And with a finite amount of time, as much as it pains me to say this, we can't be super creative about everything. There is something around focusing strategically on where are the problems. If we solve these, that's going to leverage the biggest difference to where we said that we want to go to. Then I think there's something around with that problem articulated as how might we. There's this thing that is incredibly difficult to do because this is about allowing time and space to percolate ideas. And this is something that is a perennial problem that no leader has without working really hard to get it. But creating time and space for your team to play with coming up as many ideas as possible. So when we're trying to think creatively, it's really difficult to do from a place of stress or a place of anxiety. It is true that some levels of stress can help to focus us, but broadly speaking, what you want to do as a leader is to create and give permission, time and space for your people to go off and think creatively. Most people don't have their best ideas sat at their desk or in an ideas workshop, especially those of us that sit on the more introverted end of the spectrum. A workshop where we're forced to come up with ideas is really difficult. I know this, I run them and I know how difficult it is, which is why I design mine very carefully in order to be able to attempt to get the best out of everybody. But the pressure of having to spend a day in a room with people and come up with ideas at the end is immense. And it's a starting point. It's an extremely good starting point. But it's about being able to percolate, to noodle away at ideas, to sleep on it, to bounce ideas around in your head, to have the time and space to do that with other people. Really difficult to do. But the research also shows that if we can have a playful approach to creativity, that enhances the ability for us to think creatively, make different neural connections. And as a leader, this is the bit where you can really instill that culture within your team to allow the time and space to be able to do that. But not just like, oh, let's, everyone go for a walk. It's helping to train them and educate others that this is part of the process, and it is an important part of the process about how our brains work, being relaxed, making different neural pathways that help us to come up with lots and lots of solutions.
And this is where, even though we are harnessing an innate skill, there's an element of practice in here as well, isn't there? So there's practicing as an individual and as a team to use this new way of thinking, of using our brain, basically. And I know that some of the research that I've read has talked a lot about the importance of having solo thinking time. That's actually for extroverts as much as introverts, although introverts might find that particularly helpful. So solo time where you're just completely independently noodling around an idea or a problem or a challenge in your mind, and then the opportunity to interact with others, and then possibly to iterate between those as well. So the interaction with others will mean that all those ideas that you've thought of independently come together, you mix them together, and then you iterate between, then having solo time, which inevitably happens normally because you would go home at the end of the day and you might come up with an idea in your home life, and then you bring it back into work again the next morning. But it's actually really important to intentionally create this rhythm to allow solo and group thinking to
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the bit where the rule of no idea is a bad idea or every idea is a good idea applies. This does not apply to general life, but in this bit where you have set yourself a problem to solve, the point is that you come up with as many ideas as possible. And what we tend to want to do is stop at our first idea because we're busy. We've got, lots going on. We've got to crack on. We've got deadlines to make. Don't allow your team to stop at the first idea. Help them to keep pushing on, because our first idea is the idea that's been churning around for ages and ages. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but you want loads of ideas to choose from in terms of which you take forward. And then I think the other thing as a leader here at this point is helping. You might do a bit of training, but when there's this element where you're looking for all the ideas, good or bad, let's just get everything out on the table, helping your team to build on each other's ideas. So at this point, don't squash an idea. Don't say that won't work. Don't get practical about it. That's the next bit of the process. So training your team in and build on ideas, and help me understand how that works, and training your team on not squashing ideas at that point is key.
Absolutely. So I often talk about this as divergent thinking. And when we talk about strategy, this divergent thinking stage is so important. And the biggest mistake that people make is trying to combine divergent thinking, so idea generation, with convergent thinking, which we're going to talk about in a minute. That's the next step. It does have a role, but you try and converge the two together. And what you do is someone has an idea, someone says why it won't work, and then someone else has an idea, someone else says why it won't work. Like, why would you be the third person to contribute an idea in that kind of environment? You're just not going to feel safe, psychologically safe or playful. The mindset is completely around, we need practical ideas. So instead, you separate the two parts of the process, either into different parts of a meeting or possibly even into separate meetings, so that you separate these two stages, divergent and convergent thinking.
And it's really difficult because we're used to wanting to move on quickly, and someone suggests an idea and you go, well, that won't work because we tried it before, or how would we make that system talk to that system? And we're trying to be helpful. And as a leader, your role is to really hold people to account to that rule. Some teams that I work with, if somebody squashes an idea when we're in this divergent thinking part of the process, they get called on it in a playful way, and then they have to turn their negative into a positive. So I guess I'm just acknowledging that it's our default to be helpful, say why it hasn't worked before, and let's also remember that our brains love working the same patterns again and again. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman talks about system 1 and system 2. System 1 is when we're sort of on autopilot, things we know, things that we are familiar with, regular patterns of our thinking, which is efficient, and our brains are trying to conserve energy. So we like to stay in system 1. When we're asking people to do creative thinking and go past our first ideas, we're asking them to engage in system 2, which doesn't come naturally as our first default because we want to save energy. And so therefore, time and effort spent helping people to switch into system 2 and supporting them to do it is essentially what you're doing as a leader. And sometimes that can feel like, I'm helping my team to play. That feels frivolous. Sometimes when we can understand how our brains work a little bit, that can help to switch as a leader, that you're not helping people be frivolous. Well, you kind of are, because that's kind of the point, but you're helping them to tune into a different set of neural connections in their brain that is going to help them to come up with something that is new and different, and potentially a better way of solving this important problem that you've already agreed you want to solve.
Which is a non-frivolous way to spend business time and resources. Basically, it may be frivolous in the way that it looks or the way it feels, but this is a good use of time and resource for your organization. A couple of techniques that I've used to help people continue to think beyond the first couple of ideas. The first couple of ideas are the obvious ones. One is to challenge people to write down 10 more ideas on their piece of paper.
Yeah.
And get them to then share it with a partner or share it around a small group. And they'll get to kind of number 2 or 3 and be, oh, I can't do any more. It's like, I don't care how ridiculous they are. Just, you've got to get to 10. You need 10 more. And even if they get more and more ridiculous as the list goes on, that is encouraging them to think beyond their natural neural pathways, their kind of default mode that they're in, that system's one. So that can be quite a playful, nice way to do it in a workshop. And then the other thing which is quite helpful within smaller groups or one-to-one is the simple question, what else? So it's utilizing that coaching mindset of, I'm not going to say much as the leader, I'm not going to say much as the facilitator in this workshop, I'm just going to say, what else? And you can almost even have a rule of thumb in your mind that you're going to say what else 5 times or maybe 4 times, and then the final one, it's nice to then finish up with anything else. So that tiny frame of language, you mentioned earlier, language being so important, that tiny difference between what else, meaning there is something else, I just don't think we found it yet, is what's implied in what else. Anything else implies we might be coming to our end of our list, but there may be something else, maybe there's something else there. So it can feel, as a leader or a coach or a facilitator, it can feel uncomfortable to do that. But it's incredible the number of times that there will then be a quiet moment. You hold the silence, you let the silence just sit, because that's people processing and thinking. And then someone will say something. It's like, that's the crux of the issue, or that's the really important thing that I want to shine a light on, or that's the thing that was missing from all of these other kind of things that we've been discussing so far. So some practical things that you can do with your team there as well.
I love both of those. And sometimes I might give a prize or a reward or something for the most ridiculous idea of what we would do to solve this, to help move people from that tried and tested mode of thinking.
So then once we've captured the divergent thinking in whatever format you're doing, interactive whiteboard, flip chart. I quite like the old style flip charts myself, but whatever it is that you're doing, or mural, if I'm doing it remotely. Once you've captured all of those diverse ideas, what's the next step, Lucy?
So you want as many ideas as possible. And then it's the bit for your convergent thinking. This is the bit where you're applying some rigour to all of the many, many ideas that you hopefully have at this point. And you're going back to your original problem question, and you're thinking, which are the ones with the least time, effort, budget, and has a good gut feeling about, could we test out to see if they might work? And depends on how many ideas that you have. I'd suggest you're looking for kind of at least 2 or 3 that you can test out. And gut feeling's important in there as well. I'd make that criteria as simple as possible. So simple idea can be tested with sort of minimal budget and with the resources that we currently have. And you're not looking to see if the whole idea will work. It's almost like, what's your hypothesis that you're testing to see if that has traction?
And I love the idea of combining ideas as well. So thinking, okay, so gut instinct, or just kind of a basic cognitive ranking, like which are the top contenders that we've got here? And then working, or maybe even setting off different groups around a team to then develop that idea. And in telling them, like, as many of these other ideas you can bring in, let's see how many ideas you can combine into this front runner. And that's often where the really excellent creative concepts come from, actually, is by combining multiple things that have come up in that divergent thinking stage.
Yes, and in fact, you might want to have a part before you go into that convergent thinking, where you look at your divergent thinking and go, where can we combine? Or are there things that could sit together really well? Or in that playful way, are there things that are utterly ridiculous? Let's put them together and create something even more left field from our normal thinking, in order that then we can go to the convergent stage after that.
Actually, that clustering, sometimes it's clustering that's obvious because it's around a particular theme, but challenging people to cluster the ideas that have been shared in the divergent stage in different ways is also a really useful way of keeping the creativity going, but starting to look at what are the connections, how does this work within a system, what are the implications, kind of the knock-on impact of some of these ideas on other things. And different people will cluster in different ways, which itself is a form of divergent, kind of getting diversity of thought in there. And again, if you've got, the bigger the problem or the bigger value or importance the problem, the more time it makes sense to spend. But adding that additional staging can sometimes create some other new ways of looking at the thing systemically, the challenge systemically, in a way that's quite interesting as well.
And I think that whilst you have spent time and effort figuring out the important problem to solve and putting time and effort into the language about how you're framing that problem, there's almost something around put that just to the back of your mind and play. You're not like putting yourself under load of stress. Find the answer to this problem. You're like, how am I playing with what all the different options might be to solve this? Take the pressure off, take the stress off, take the cortisol, adrenaline that you get from when you're asked to think outside the box. As a leader, your job is to remove that as much as you can from your team and genuinely allow time to percolate and play.
And it's almost like you then at the convergence stage, you bring that problem back front and center.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it's okay, that stage has been useful. We're now moving to the next stage. Let's bring the problem back to the middle of our thinking.
Yeah.
And now you're looking for how these ideas actually relate directly to solving that problem that you framed earlier. Yeah. I love as well the importance that you mentioned there around testing. And this is something that actually I see happen far less than I'd like to see, which is people will often come to the end of this process, and it's a cognitive process generally, whether it's solo thinking, group thinking, we're using our brain to solve this. But quite rarely is there a challenge that you could just solve through cognitive thought. Quite often, almost all the time actually, there's a benefit to actually doing something in the real world, and that's where your testing comes in. You've got a hypothesis, we think this is going to work, we think this is going to solve the problem. What's the smallest steps that we can take to test that and learn from it, and then continually refining the solution that you're defining, before then finally implementing something, especially if there's any significant budget involved in implementing the final decision.
What's the smallest thing that we can do to test whether this has the potential to work? That can also be quicker, cheaper, and more effective than modeling a business case. It's like, look, here's some data. We've tried this out. And what I mean by things like this is, can you mock up a website? So say if it's a product, can you mock up a website that just says this product that does X, Y, Z coming soon. If you're interested in hearing more about it, once we've launched it, give us your email. If no one gives their details, then that's pretty much a little signal that that's maybe not what your customers want. If lots of people sign up, that's a kind of signal that actually this might be worth pursuing a bit more. And having that actual data is more reliable and effective than business modeling something for 6 months, a year out from now. And what I find is that what I have found on occasion, if something is new and you need to get something signed off by a senior leadership team, it can be a really good tactic to help manage fear, to go, can you remodel that? And it's a stalling tactic. If you've got the actual data and you're saying, okay, and our next test is going to be the next small step, rather than a great big project, that takes some of the risk out of it for you and for the senior leadership team that are managing this change that you are putting in place.
And again, analogy to strategy, really similarly, like people often think of strategy as being, all the people with the big brains and the most MBAs as possible, and you've got your statistical analysis and your management consultants doing all of their different modeling and hypothesis testing, like statistic hypothesis testing. that isn't actually what works. You need a certain element of that. And what you need at the end of the day then is someone who's actually going to put it into action and see what happens.
Yeah.
So what you're describing here is the exact analogy. This isn't a competition to see who can come up with the cleverest, most detailed, complex business plan that's going to get you,
nowhere.
100% marks in your, kind of MBA assignment. This is real world innovation. Let's see what happens. Let's test it out.
Yeah.
And that's actually, when you track back success in business, that tends to be people who are more oriented towards action.
Yeah.
That kind of gravitate to this approach tend to then be more successful.
Yeah.
So, yeah, fantastic. Is there anything else that we've missed? What else might be important around leading a creative team or helping your team to be more creative?
I think as always, it's leading by example. So if you are saying to your team, get out of the office, go to where you have your best ideas, noodle over this problem, you need to be doing it too.
Yeah.
Giving permission to play, you need to be playing with the team on ideas. You need to be suggesting some things that are ridiculous to show that it is part of the process and that it's okay. So I think that piece around leading by example is key.
Yeah.
And yes, anding ideas and holding people to account. If someone accidentally goes, well, that won't work, holding them to account to turn that won't work into how might we make that work.
Yeah.
And at every stage of the process, I think, is looking at the language that you're using and helping people to truly believe and feel good about their involvement in the process and the ideas and input that they're making and how it is helping towards solve that bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's won't happen overnight.
Yeah.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes, exactly. And so we're looking at an innate skill, but a skill that does need practice. And that can be at the individual level as well as at the group, team, organization level as well. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So some key takeaways. What's the key things that you want people to take away who are listening to this?
You're creative. End of.
Yeah.
No one's allowed. I'm going to get to a point where I go, no one's allowed to say to me, but I don't think I'm creative.
Yeah. Yep.
If you're a human being, you are creative. You can have ideas. You can solve problems. There's something around permission to play and that piece around lots and lots of ideas, making different connections is absolutely key. And I think enjoy it. Enjoy the learning process because, yes, it's inherent. And like many inherent skills, the more you practice, the better you get.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So for me, I think making time for this, and actually we've got another whole episode. I think our very first episode of the podcast was about making time. So jump back and listen to that if that feels like that's going to be a sticking point for you. So making time for this is really important. This is not as playful as it will feel and should feel as you're doing it. This is a very valuable use of your organization's time and resources. And then the importance of separating that divergent and convergent. I think that's the area that I see people make the most mistakes, is not understanding that the divergent thinking and convergent thinking are two separate stages. So the idea generation should be separated from the idea judgment or the kind of combination of decision making at the end of the process. So separating those two is really important. And then finally, I think practicing this playful mindset outside of work as well. If we're trying to train new neural pathways, trying to get out of our default mode into a new way of thinking, I think you're going to get there even faster if you can do this outside work too. And so mixing up things in your routine, your habits, being playful around other things you're doing, I think that's going to have an infectious impact on the way you are at work as well.
Completely agree. And even things like you're trying to shift neural pathways. So reading a different newsfeed, going a slightly different route to work, having a different coffee, all of those things might sound like really small and a little bit silly, but it's about making different neural connections, and that's what you are aiming to do in that divergent bit of the creative thinking process.
And on that note, my 10-year-old daughter has got into the habit now of going into my phone, changing the font, the colour, the settings, the background, the wallpaper. I've stopped telling her off because I've realised the positive impact this has on me, of actually every time I open my phone, who knows what I'm going to find in there. But it is about just shifting the neural pathways, and it genuinely makes a difference, I reckon. So yeah, being intentional and playful about being playful in the rest of life, I think is going to help as a leader of a creative team as well.
Agreed.
Brilliant. I'm sure we will come back to the topic of creativity because it's something obviously you're very knowledgeable about, we're both very passionate about, but I think that's it for this time. So thank you for spending this time with us, everyone. Don't forget that if we want to make our voice heard, our impact felt, then we need to gift ourselves the space to think, the courage to lead, and the confidence to adapt. I'm Juliet Corbett.
And I'm Lucy Gower. Thank you for listening to the Quiet Leadership Revolution.